All right, so let's dive into something super important if you're getting ready for the CCSP exam.
Okay.
Threat modeling and risk analysis,
hmm
especially when we're talking about building secure software.
Right.
It can get pretty complex.
It can.
But understanding this stuff, it's not just about passing the exam, it's really about becoming a really great cybersecurity pro.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's not just checking boxes for the exam. This is knowledge that you're going to use day in and day out if you want to build and maintain really secure systems in the real world.
Okay, so let's start with something that might feel pretty basic at first.
Okay.
Identifying threats.
Right.
I imagine there's a little more to it than just, thinking up a list of things that could go wrong.
You're exactly right. It's not just about brainstorming. You need a structured approach.
Oh.
If you just brainstorm, you're very likely to miss crucial threats. Think about it like investigating a crime scene. You wouldn't just wander around hoping to find something. You'd use specific techniques to make sure you're thoroughly investigating every possible place that evidence might be found.
Okay, so what are some of those methods when it comes to figuring out these threats when we're talking about software development?
Yeah, so there are a few key approaches. One that's commonly used is an asset-focused approach,
Hmm.
where you go through and analyze every single one of your organization's assets and think about what could threaten them.
Hmm.
This could include your web server, your databases, cloud infrastructure, even physical hardware. For
Hmm.
example, if you're looking at your website, just thinking about like a basic website, a threat to its availability, that could be something like a fiber optic cable being cut, or you could have a DDoS attack.
So it sounds like you're really breaking down.
Yep.
Instead of just thinking about attackers in general, you're thinking, what specific things are they going to target?
Exactly. What are those key assets that an attacker would be interested in, and how would they go about attacking them?
What other approaches are there?
Another one is threat-focused.
Okay.
In this case, you start with a list of potential threats.
Mm-hmm.
Could be hackers, could be natural disasters, it could even be a disgruntled employee.
Right.
And then you analyze how each one of those threats could impact your systems. It's kind of like putting yourself in the shoes of an attacker
Oh, that's interesting.
and thinking, okay, if I wanted to cause damage to this system, how would I do it?
It's almost like a game of cybersecurity chess.
Exactly.
You're trying to anticipate your opponent's
You're
move.
trying to think like them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, are there any other ways to go about this initial threat identification?
Yeah, for sure. One more that's particularly relevant for a lot of companies these days is service-focused.
Okay.
So this involves looking at every interface of a service, for example, a public API, and identifying threats to each one of those interfaces. For example, if you have an API and it allows people to upload data,
Okay.
you'd need to think about injection attacks or attempts to upload malicious files.
So no matter which method you use, it seems like it's really about having that framework.
Exactly.
Yeah, having that structure to your approach.
Yeah,
And is this basically the first step in threat modeling?
exactly.
Yeah.
This is step one. It's laying the groundwork.
All right.
You can't model threats effectively if you don't know what you're dealing with. It's like trying to build a house without a blueprint. You might end up with something, but it's probably not going to be very structurally sound.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the risks that are just inherent in software development.
Okay.
We all know that software can be incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest risks that we really need to think about, especially if we're thinking about that CCSP exam?
Well, the thing to remember is that security needs to be baked into the entire software development lifecycle, or SDLC, as we call it. It doesn't
Right.
matter if you're using Waterfall Agile or some other model. Security can't be an afterthought.
So we can't treat it like it's something optional,
No.
like it's an add-on,
Right.
like you can just slap it on at the end.
You can't tack it on at the end. You have to think about security from the beginning.
What happens when companies treat security like that?
If you treat it as a bolt-on, it almost always leads to poorly designed security measures.
Uh-huh.
And they're not only ineffective, but they can actually harm the functionality of the software itself. It's like trying to fix a cracked foundation by just putting a fresh coat of paint on the house. It might look better on the surface, but you still have that underlying problem.
So what are some specific security risks that developers really need to be aware of? I know the CCSP exam covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, it does. Some of the big ones are SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflows. Those are all vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit to gain access to sensitive data or even take control of systems.
So how do we mitigate those risks? We can't just hope that developers write perfect code all the time, right?
You're right. Everyone makes mistakes. That's why we have things called mitigation techniques. You need to think of it like wearing a seatbelt.
Mm.
Even if you're a really great driver, you still wear a seatbelt just in case.
Uh-huh.
Some common mitigation techniques include validating all user input to prevent things like SQL injection, encrypting any sensitive data that you're storing in a database, and enforcing the principle of least privilege, which basically means that users only have access to the information they absolutely need to do their job.
Okay, so we're validating inputs, we're protecting that data, we're limiting who has access.
Right?
What about testing? I imagine that plays a pretty big role.
Testing is absolutely essential. And
Yeah.
we have tools like sandboxes and code repositories that can help with this. They provide controlled environments for development and testing, so you can catch and fix vulnerabilities before you release the code to the public.
So it's all about creating those layers of protection throughout that whole development
Yeah.
process. And this brings us to kind of the heart of it all,
Yes.
threat modeling. Now, we've touched on it a little bit, but can you explain a little bit more? What is it exactly, and why is it so important when we're trying to analyze potential attacks?
Basically, threat modeling is a structured process that helps you identify, analyze, and prioritize potential threats to your systems. You're putting yourself in the attacker's shoes and saying, okay, if I wanted to exploit this system, how would I do it, and what would be the impact?
It's like a game of cybersecurity chess, but with real-world consequences.
Right.
Now, I know there are different approaches to threat modeling. One that I've heard a lot about, especially getting ready for the CCSP exam, is the STRIDE model.
Yes.
Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. STRIDE is a really useful framework for categorizing threats based on their characteristics. Each letter in the word STRIDE stands for a different type of threat.
Okay, let's go through them one by one. What does S stand for?
S stands for spoofing, which basically means faking an identity to gain access to a system. Think of something like a phishing email that appears to be from a legitimate source. Right. Or even something like spoofing an IP address to bypass network security.
So it's all about tricking the system into thinking you're someone that you're not.
Exactly.
And I imagine strong authentication is a big part of combating that.
Absolutely. Multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, biometrics. Yeah. These are your best defenses against spoofing attacks because they make it much more difficult for an attacker to impersonate a legitimate user.
Okay, what about T? What does that represent in the STRIDE model?
T is for tampering, which means making unauthorized changes to data or systems. Imagine someone like a student hacking into a school database to change their grades, or a disgruntled employee modifying financial records.
Yikes. Definitely not a good situation. What about R?
R stands for repudiation, which is essentially denying responsibility for an action. Think of it like someone who makes an unauthorized transfer of funds and then claims that they never did it. Things like digital signatures and audit trails become really important here because you need a way to prove accountability and prevent someone from just saying, nope, wasn't me.
It's about making sure that you can track actions
Exactly.
to whoever did them.
Right.
Okay, so what does that stand for in the STRIDE model?
I is for information disclosure, which is unauthorized access to sensitive data. This could be anything from a competitor stealing trade secrets to a hacker getting their hands on customer credit card information
Oh, yeah?
to a government agency leaking classified documents.
Data breaches
Data breaches, exactly.
was always in the news.
It is. It's a major concern for any organization that handles sensitive data.
Great. How about D?
D is for denial of service attacks, which are often shortened to DOS. These aim to disrupt services and make systems unavailable to legitimate users. Think of a website that gets bombarded with so much traffic that it crashes,
Oh, yeah.
preventing anyone from accessing it. Or a network that gets flooded with requests so that legitimate users can't connect.
Like when a website crashes during a big sale.
Exactly, like a big product launch.
Yeah.
That can be incredibly frustrating for users.
Yes.
And can cause real damage to a company's reputation and bottom line.
For sure. Okay, last but not least, E. What does that one represent?
E is for elevation of privilege. Sometimes it's also called privilege escalation. This is when an attacker exploits a vulnerability to gain higher level access than they're supposed to have.
Okay.
So, for example, a standard user might figure out a way to gain administrative rights, which would allow them to control sensitive systems and data.
So it's like going from a pawn to a queen in a chess game.
Yeah, exactly.
And I imagine that's a pretty common goal for attackers, right? They want to get that high-level access.
Oh, yeah. Once they have elevated privileges, it really opens up a lot more possibilities for them to do damage.
Yeah. So we have this STRIDE model to categorize threats, which is super helpful. But I know there are a bunch of other threat modeling approaches out there. What are some of the others that we should know, especially in the context of getting ready for that CCSP exam?
Yeah. There are quite a few, and they all have their pros and cons. One you might come across is PASTA,
Oh.
which focuses on collaboration between developers and business leaders to analyze risks. The goal is to integrate security into the business decision-making process.
So with PASTA, it's really emphasizing that security is not just a technical issue.
Right.
It's a business issue as well.
Absolutely.
What are some of the other approaches?
Another one is DREAD,
Okay.
which stands for damage reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. It's basically a way to rank threats based on how much damage they could cause, how easy they are to reproduce, how likely they are to be exploited, how many users would be affected, and how easily the vulnerability can be discovered.
So with DREAD, you're going a step further. You're not just identifying threats. You're actually trying to assess how risky each one is.
Exactly, you're quantifying the risk.
What else is out there?
Then there's ATSM, which stands for Advanced Threat and Attack Simulation Methodology. This one involves actually simulating attacks against your system to try to find vulnerabilities and see how well your defenses hold up.
So it's kind of like running a fire drill
Exactly.
to make sure that if something bad happens, everyone knows what to do.
Right. You're proactively testing your security controls rather than just waiting for an attack to happen and then reacting.
Okay, so no matter which approach you choose, it seems like visualization is a big part of this process.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about system diagrams and how helpful they can be.
They're incredibly helpful. Visualizing your systems and how data flows through them can really help you understand where the weaknesses are. It's like having a map of your castle and seeing all the potential ways that an attacker might be able to get in.
Can you walk us through an example? Let's say we're looking at like a typical e-commerce website.
Okay.
What would a system diagram for that look like? And how would it help us with threat modeling?
Okay, so imagine a diagram with a few key components. You've got your web server, which is what users interact with directly.
Right.
That web server connects to an e-commerce database, which stores things like product information, customer data, and so on. Then you have an authentication server to verify user identities and an authentication database to store all those credentials. And of course, you have firewalls to protect the whole system from external threats.
Got it. So how does actually looking at this diagram help us identify threats?
Well, the arrows in the diagram show how data flows between these different components.
Right.
And by tracing those flows, you can start to see potential weak points. For example, if the web server is directly connected to the e-commerce database, an attacker might be able to exploit a vulnerability in the web server, like a SQL injection vulnerability, to gain access to all that sensitive data in the database.
So it's almost like seeing the cracks in the armor of your system.
Exactly. And once you understand how data flows, you can start to think about how to reinforce those weak points.
Now, is this what's known as reduction analysis?
Yes. Reduction analysis is all about breaking down a complex system into smaller, more manageable pieces. And by analyzing each piece, you can get a much clearer picture of where the vulnerabilities might be and come up with better strategies to address them.
It's that old divide and conquer approach.
Exactly.
And we were talking about attack surfaces and attack vectors. How do those concepts fit into this whole idea of reduction analysis?
Okay, so your total attack surface is basically everything in your system that's exposed to potential attacks. By using reduction analysis to break down the system, you can identify all those exposed points and start figuring out how to make them smaller.
So it's about knowing the full scope of what's vulnerable.
Right.
And what about attack vectors?
An attack vector is simply the method an attacker uses to exploit a vulnerability and get into your system.
Okay.
And the diagram we were just talking about can help you visualize those potential attack vectors, like that SQL injection example.
So it all ties together. Reduction analysis helps us understand our attack surface and identify potential attack vectors, which then helps us with threat modeling and figuring out how to best protect our systems.
That's it. And one of the key things to remember is that by reducing the complexity of our systems, we can make that attack surface smaller, which makes it much harder for attackers to find and exploit vulnerabilities.
So it's not just about building bigger and more complex systems. It's about making sure that they're designed securely from the ground up.
Absolutely. Security has to be part of the design process, not something you add on later.
And I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part. We'll pick back up in part 2 and get even deeper into some of these concepts.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back. Let's keep going with this threat modeling and risk analysis. I think it'd be good to dive a little deeper into some of these concepts.
Okay.
Especially since anybody who wants to ace that CCSP exam
Right.
needs to have a really solid understanding of all this stuff.
Yeah. I'm really intrigued by this whole idea of reduction analysis.
Okay.
I get the basic concept, but I'd love to hear more about how you actually use it in the real world.
Yeah, it's a really powerful technique. Let's say you're trying to figure out how secure a cloud infrastructure is,
Uh-huh.
and it's got all these different interconnected services and components.
Right.
If you try to analyze the whole thing all at once, it can be really overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like trying to do a giant jigsaw puzzle
Yeah.
without sorting the pieces first.
Exactly. Reduction analysis helps you break that massive puzzle into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay.
So you might start by looking at just one server or one virtual machine. You analyze how it's configured,
Right.
what vulnerabilities it might have, all in isolation.
Okay.
Or you might take a complex software application and break it down into its individual modules, and then you examine each one of those pieces for potential weaknesses.
So it's almost like you're zooming in
Yeah.
on specific parts of the system to really get a clear picture of how they work and where those vulnerabilities might be.
Right, and by isolating those components, you can also start to see the potential attack vectors.
Oh, okay. So how does that work?
Well, by looking at how data flows between different parts of the system, you can see those pathways that attackers might use to exploit weaknesses. It's like mapping out all the tunnels in a network and figuring out all the different routes that an intruder could take.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we talk about attack vectors, how does that relate back to the total attack surface? We've talked about that in the first part.
Yeah, so think of your organization's total attack surface as the sum of all the things that are exposed to potential attack. That includes your systems, your services, even your personnel.
Wow, so it's not just about digital systems.
No, it's not.
It's about understanding all the different points of vulnerability,
Right.
whether they're physical or digital.
Exactly. It's like the perimeter of a fortress. It includes everything from your digital assets to your physical infrastructure to the people who work for you.
So the attack surface is the what, and the attack vector is the how.
That's a good way to put it. The attack vector is the specific method an attacker uses to get through that perimeter.
So it could be something like sending a phishing email,
Right.
or exploiting a vulnerability in a web application,
Exactly.
or even something like physically breaking into a server room.
All of those are possible attack vectors.
And I'm guessing that the best way to minimize both the attack surface and the potential attack vectors is to reduce complexity.
You got it. The more complex your systems are, the bigger your attack surface is going to be. And that means more potential attack vectors. It's like building a fortress with 1,000 windows and doors.
Right.
It's way harder to defend than a simple structure with just a few well-defined entry points.
That reminds me of that saying, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication.
Yeah.
And it seems like in cybersecurity, that's especially true.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most secure systems are the ones that are the simplest and the easiest to understand.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about these attack surfaces and attack vectors.
Right.
And it makes me think about security controls.
Okay.
What are some of the most effective security controls when we're thinking about mitigating software security risks?
Well, first you have preventative controls.
Ah.
These are designed to stop attacks from happening in the first place. Things like firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, strong authentication methods, and writing secure code.
So those preventative controls are like having a strong wall around your fortress and guards at the gate
Exactly.
to stop intruders from getting in.
Right.
What about detective controls?
Those are all about finding attacks that have already happened.
Okay.
Or are happening right now. Things like SIEM systems that look at logs for any suspicious activity intrusion detection systems that can alert you to potential intrusions and regular security audits.
So it's like having surveillance cameras and motion sensors inside your fortress
That's a good
to
analogy.
catch any suspicious activity that's going on.
They-
Okay, and then there were corrective controls.
Right.
How do those fit into the whole security picture?
Those focus on minimizing damage after an attack
Okay,
and getting things back to a secure state.
so what kind of things are we talking about?
Things like incident response plans
Right.
that tell you exactly what to do if there's a breach, data backup and recovery procedures,
Oh,
and
yeah.
patching systems to fix any vulnerabilities that were exploited.
So it's like having a team of responders who can fix any damage and get things back to normal as quickly as possible.
That's right. It's all about being prepared and having a plan in place.
So it sounds like you really need a multi-layered approach to security
Absolutely.
with different types of controls working together,
You need preventative, detective, and corrective controls all working in harmony.
like a well-orchestrated symphony.
I like that analogy. But remember, it's not just about technology.
Right.
The human element is huge.
Absolutely.
Because guess what? Humans are often the weakest link in the security chain.
It's true. We all make mistakes.
We do. We fall for phishing scams. We accidentally give away sensitive information.
Oh, we're all human?
Exactly. And that's why security awareness training is so important.
It is.
You have to teach employees about the threats out there.
Right.
Things like phishing, social engineering, the importance of strong passwords.
Yeah. It's about empowering employees to be part of the solution, not the problem.
That's a great way to put it. Because even if you have the best technology in the world,
Yeah.
it's not going to help if someone clicks on a bad link or gives their password to a scammer.
So it's about creating a culture of security.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where everyone understands that they have a role to play in keeping information safe.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying threats, analyzing risks, mitigation techniques, the importance of security controls,
Right.
and the human element in cybersecurity.
It's a lot.
It is.
But it's all connected.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for anyone who's getting ready for that CCSP exam.
Absolutely.
I feel like I have a much better grasp on all this now.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
But I'm sure there's still more to learn.
Oh, there's always more to learn in this field. But this is a good place to take a break
Okay,
and let everything sink in. We'll come back in a minute
sounds good.
and wrap up this whole deep dive
Okay.
with some final thoughts and maybe some questions to get you thinking even more about all this stuff.
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back. And we're back.
We are.
Ready to kind of wrap up our deep dive into threat modeling and risk analysis?
Okay.
I feel like I've learned so much about how to really approach these topics,
Good.
especially as I'm studying for the CCSP exam.
It's a challenging exam,
It is.
but it really tests your knowledge of some of the most critical concepts in cybersecurity.
So let's recap some of the key things that we talked about. We started by discussing structured threat identification
Right.
and how it's not enough to just, jot down a list of potential problems.
Right. You need a system.
Yeah, you need a structured approach. Whether it's asset-focused, threat-focused, or service-focused, you really got to make sure that you're thinking about all those possible threats.
And that structured approach really sets you up for success when you start doing threat modeling.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time talking about threat modeling.
Who did?
We discussed different models like Stride, Pasta, Dread, ATASM,
Oh, great frameworks.
each with their own way of identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing those potential threats.
Yeah, and I think another key takeaway is that security really needs to be part of the entire software development process.
You can't be an afterthought.
No, absolutely not. Trying to add security at the end is just asking for trouble.
So it needs to be baked in from the very beginning.
From day one.
And that means understanding those specific security risks.
Right.
Like SQL
yes.
injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflows.
Oh, the big ones.
And knowing how to mitigate those risks with secure coding practices,
Yeah.
input validation, encryption, things like that.
Exactly. And of course, we talked about visualization.
Yeah.
Using diagrams to map out your systems and see how data flows through them.
Those system diagrams can be really helpful.
They are. They let you see your system through the eyes of an attacker.
Yeah, and we talked about how important it is to have a multi-layered security approach
Right.
with different types of controls,
Preventative, detective, corrective.
all working together.
All essential parts of a good security strategy.
And finally, we can't forget about the human element.
No, we can't.
We talked about how important security awareness training is.
It's one of the best things you can do to improve your security posture.
It really is. Because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
humans are often the weakest link.
That's true.
And we need to empower them to be part of the solution, not the problem.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We hear.
And I hope everyone listening feels a little more confident about tackling threat modeling and risk analysis.
They too. And to all of our listeners out there, keep up the great work and best of luck on that CCSP journey.
You got this.